Let's take a look at gram-positive bacteria next, and there we have two categories, the low GC ratio and the high GC ratio bacteria. So the Firmicutes are low GC content, and this refers to nucleotides, so guanine and cytosine. So they have relatively low content, and then actinobacteria have high G and C ratios. Okay, so starting out with the Firmicutes, the low GC gram-positive bacteria, there we have the Clostridia, which we already covered in pathogen group number 1, so some of the ones that make you sick anyway. So we have the Clostridiales, and they're definitely the genus Clostridium. They all produce endospores, as you know. The obligate anaerobes, they don't like oxygen. In fact, oxygen is toxic to them. And there we have some very important pathogens, as you know. Clostridium tetani, Clostridium botulinum, Clostridium perfringens, and Clostridium difficile. All 4 of them are in pathogen group number 1, and you do need to know about these. Then here we have a more exotic, on the more exotic side, Epulopiscium. This one is huge. It's like the biggest bacterium ever. You can see that without a microscope. And the daughter cells, they form within the parent cell, so they don't do binary fission, which is kind of interesting. So here, this is here we have C. diff. That is the most common cause of nosocomial or hospital-acquired diarrhea, C. diff. And here there's the endospore, so Clostridium difficile. Yeah, so here the endospore, nice and big, labeled. And now moving on here to this giant prokaryote that you can see without a microscope. That's Epulopiscium. And compare this to Paramecium. This is a eukaryotic cell. This one is already pretty big. Some of these Paramecium, there's 100 to 200 micrometers in length from here to here. Now this one here is huge. This is like a whole millimeter, and you can definitely see that. So it's a giant prokaryote. Okay, and more of the Firmicutes with the low GC content. We have Bacillales. That's a very large group, and there we have the Bacillus species, or the genus Bacillus. These are endospore producing rods, and we will have several of them in our pathogen groups. Bacillus anthracis, the cause of anthrax. We do have that in our pathogen groups. And then we have Bacillus thuringiensis. This one is an insect pathogen that we will not be talking much further about, but it's an interesting one that can it can be used to control insect populations. And Bacillus cereus, this is one that we usually work with in the lab, but of course we wouldn't be sending this home with you guys. So Bacillus cereus, that one has really cool spores for a spore stain. It can also act as a pathogen and cause food poisoning. And then we have Staphylococcus, and this is definitely something you already have heard about. So Staphylococcus, the name describes the arrangement. So we have grape-like clusters of round bacteria, and bacterium that you have already heard quite a bit about is Staphylococcus aureus. And that one is usually it's pretty harmless, but there are certain strains of Staph aureus that can cause really bad infections, and so wound infections, childbed fever. A lot of times Staph aureus, because it's so common and has been exposed to many antibiotics for treatment, it's often antibiotic resistant, and you may have heard of MRSA, methicillin resistant Staphylococcus aureus, and that's definitely something to watch out for. So some of the Staph aureus strains, they produce an enterotoxin as well. So here is a Bacillus endospore. It's kind of a weird picture, I feel like, but here's sort of this endospore that's forming inside of the cell, and we will be doing a spore stain pretty soon anyway. So let's move on here. Staphylococcus aureus, these golden colonies that are forming. And if you look under the microscope, here you have even this 3D effect. You see these grape-like clusters of these cocci, and definitely Staphylococcus aureus. Aureus comes from the Latin aurum, which is gold. So these golden in color. The colonies also have this golden color. And under the microscope, you see grape-like clusters of spherical bacteria. Okay, then we have more Firmicutes. The lactobacillus, these guys, lactobacillus is very common for yogurt production, also in combination with sourdough yeast, and so it's very useful for food production. So lactobacillus is very common, used in dairy products and bread making. So here, let's start up here. These are the lactobacillus. Those are aerotolerant anaerobes. They produce lactic acid from simple carbohydrates. So that's kind of similar to human cells. When you don't do aerobic metabolism, then you would produce lactic acid as as your glycolysis product. So the lactobacillus, we have many, and I suspect that our samples that we took, we have cultured probably many lactobacilli. They colonize the body, and again, they're useful for food production, various products. So here, we continue here with the Streptococcus. This one is also in the group of the lactobacillus, but somewhat different. It's when we have some pathogens here. So strepto means chain, and coccus, round bacteria. They come in chains. So we have spherical bacteria that come in chains. So a lot of them are actually very destructive to human tissue. So they can do beta hemolysis. That means they can hemolyze blood agar, and they form sort of this area of clearing in a blood agar. That is a way to detect something like Streptococcus pyogenes, which cause very high fever. There are also some non-beta hemolytic streptococci, for example, Streptococcus pneumoniae, which is a pathogen that we will be talking about, and Streptococcus mutans. That one apparently causes dental caries, but we do not have this one on a pathogen group, but you will have it in your mouth pretty commonly. So here's Streptococcus. Nice picture here of these chains of spherical bacteria. So Streptococcus, and here more continuation of lactobacillus. We have Enterococcus. These would be found in the intestine, and there we have a common one that's found in the intestine, human intestine, as well as Enterococcus faecalis or Enterococcus faecium. They can cause problems by infecting wounds, and also they can be causing urinary tract infections, nosocomial infections. And here's another one that we will be talking about in a pathogen group. That's Listeria monocytogenes. This one can contaminate food and cause problems. And now here is our final group of the Firmicutes, the low GC gram-positive bacteria, and those are mycoplasmas. They're very difficult to grow and culture because they lack cell walls. So because they don't have a defined shape defined by their cell wall, they are pleomorphic. That means they can assume many shapes. And here's a pathogen, Mycoplasma pneumoniae, that causes pneumonia, mild pneumonia in this case, but we don't have this one on our pathogen group. So here's Mycoplasma pneumonia. You can see sort of this, I don't know, they form these almost like dome shapes there, but they're very difficult to grow in culture. Okay, moving on to the high GC gram-positive bacteria. And there we have the actinobacteria. And here, so they start out with the high GC content. And there we have a few that part of pathogens that we will be discussing. The Corynebacterium, diphtheriae, this one we already did, the cause of diphtheria. Propionibacterium, will not hear too much about it. Gardnerella, also not so much. Actinomyces and Streptomyces species, they're important sources of antibiotics, and we will cover them in a different context. So they're not covered as pathogens, but as sources of antibiotics. And then we have Frankia and Nocardia. You will not hear too much about them, but Let's take a look at them. Actinobacteria, high GC content. They're often pleomorphic, means they have many shapes, and they have a lot of times these branching filaments, and often are inhabitants of soil. Let's start out with an important one that's also part of our pathogen group, and that is the Mycobacterium. It is acid fast because it has mycolic acid as part of the cell wall, which makes it super tough to treat. They are typically very slow growing, but once you're infected with them, it's a real problem because they're very difficult to treat, very hard to get rid of. So 2 pathogens that we will definitely be discussing is Mycobacterium tuberculosis, the cause of tuberculosis, and Mycobacterium leprae, the cause of leprosy. So you'll hear more about these in pathogen groups. And then here, another important pathogen, Corynebacterium. This one we already covered. Corynebacterium diphtheriae, the cause of diphtheria. Definitely need to know this. And then Propionibacterium. This one causes more of a cosmetic problem because it causes acne. So this would be Propionibacterium acnes, causing acne. And then Gardnerella. There's an pathogen that we will not cover in another pathogen group, and that would be Gardnerella vaginalis, the cause of vaginitis, but we don't have this one in a pathogen group. And Frankia, this one forms these nitrogen fixing nodules on tree roots. Okay, now here some important species, and we will discuss them more when we talk about antibiotics. So the Streptomyces species and the Actinomyces species, the Streptomyces species in particular, they produce just about the majority of the antibiotics that we have in use these days, or modified from Streptomyces, originally isolated antibiotics that then got modified. But Streptomyces species, they grow in soil, and they produce a variety of antibiotics. And in that context, we will hear more about them again. Actinomyces, they have a lot of times in your mouth or throat. They can be pathogenic, but we will not be discussing them in that context. Nocardia, also these fragmenting filaments, also acid fast, and apparently Nocardia asteroides causes pulmonary infections, but we do not have this one on a pathogen group. So you can here see the Streptomyces species. You can tell why they're called myces. That refers to sort of filamentous fungus-like growth. And you can definitely see the filament here, so that resembles more the growth of a fungus. And then even here the conidiospores and coils. So that's really, it's very close to what a fungus growth looks like, or mold growth looks like. So that's kind of interesting about the Streptomyces species right here. And here would be a picture of Actinomyces, also interesting looking bacterium. And now our final group, and these guys always take the back seat. Nobody really pays attention to them, even though they're super interesting. They get a grand total of 3 slides or so. And it's a whole domain, the domain of the Archaea. So again, we'll just cover them briefly here. They're subdivided into 3 groups, into those that like the heat, that would be the thermophiles. Then we have the ones that love the salt, those are the halophiles, and then the ones that produce methane, those are the methanogens. So let's start here from the top. It's a whole domain because of their very distinctly different genetics, and so they really don't belong either with the eukaryotes or with the eubacteria, even though they are truly prokaryotes. But they do not have peptidoglycans, cell walls, and they're just really different. So we have these 3 groups: the halophiles, the salt lovers. They require salt concentration of above 25%, which is extreme. The thermophiles, they love it hot, above 80 degrees Celsius, very hot. I mean, consider 100 degrees is boiling. And methanogens, they produce methane. So those are the 3 groups. They're considered extremophiles because they either love extreme salt or extreme heat, or they produce some extreme gas, I guess. Okay, so here is a picture of what Archaea might look like. It's not really that much you can tell from this, but the microbial diversity here, it would be really cool to know more about the Archaea, but nobody really studies them, I guess, because they don't make us sick. We don't really pay attention to them. But there are thousands of species, and you could use PCR reactions to identify them, but nobody really wants to put the money in to identify all of these different species. There's definitely some very interesting and maybe even strange kind of metabolism. We could learn a lot from them, I'm sure, but nobody really puts money into studying them. So many of these guys have not been identified. So maybe, I don't know if we'll ever get to this point, but at this point, nobody really puts money into this, and they haven't been cultured. And while they would be interesting, there's really just no money in this. And here's my final picture, my final slide for chapter 11. Finish it off with a nice image here of Thiomargarita namibiensis. And sounds like a purple margarita to me. So yeah, looks interesting. But again, unfortunately, those very interesting Archaea, they usually take a sidetrack. Nobody pays too much attention to them. Okay, this is it for chapter 11. And stay tuned for the viruses, which will come up next in chapter 13.